very impersonal. It's not a personal God. It's more impersonal. You can't really... He's more distant. He's there, but he's more distant, and I don't see that in Scripture. But anyway, there's a lot of very good things in here. And it turns out that he is called working class sage, because I don't know about these other men that are often presented on. Are they more professionals, or were they working class people? Like,
I think they're all professionals.
Pardon me?
I think they're all professionals.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this guy, as you can see, he was forced to leave school and go to work when his father died, basically. And he became a reporter, journalist, and he loved to write, and he had interests, spiritual interests, obviously. So he wrote a number of books, From Poverty to Power, The Light of Reason. He had a magazine. And his biggest accomplishment was a book called As a Man Thinketh, which is based on a scripture in Proverbs. As a man thinketh, so is he. Because his core philosophy was that a person's thoughts is what drives everything in the person. If not the cause of his circumstances, is the cause of himself and shapes the tenor of his life. There's something called the law of attraction, which some say, and I think there's a lot of evidence, that if you think something, if you think positively about life in general, you're going to have more positive things happening to you, or you may interpret them as more positively, I suppose. As if you're negative all the time, all these negative things happen, and they seem bizarre. I know someone who's very negative, and has been for a long time, and she parks her car on a street where there's all these cars parked, a street she's never been on before. She's gone for a couple hours. She comes back. Her car's the only one covered with bird poop. I don't get it, but it seems to happen. Things just, they don't seem random, but they seem to match the person's way of thinking, their attitude. So that's what I understand as the law of attraction. And so that's got a lot to do with what he's saying here. But he seems to be what my internet research said, he's the pioneer of modern inspirational thought and the self-help movement, where you think, what you think makes such a difference. The Power of Positive Thinking came after him by Norman Vincent Peale. And much later, not that long ago, a book that I've never read, but called Attitude is Everything, Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. And we can all understand how that works, but they're really all saying the same thing. And from what I can gather, none of it's new. It's been in the scriptures for thousands and thousands of years. Because God is concerned with our thoughts, which lead to our actions. But as Jesus said, if you lust after a woman to commit adultery, you don't have to do it. It's as if you've done it. If you got to control your thoughts, the first thought that comes into your mind is a natural thought, but that doesn't mean we have to stay with it. We can fight it, or we can just nurse it along and let it grow. But we choose which way it goes. Last fall, I presented on a book called You Are Not Your Brain, which talked about kind of scientific ways of understanding temptation and how we can fight temptation. And what it mentioned was that we often have what they call deceptive brain messages, this natural first thought that we get that's wrong. It's not true. And why is that? Because often it's because when we are young, we are so affected by our environments, and we're immature, so we develop these coping mechanisms that work for us at that time, but they're so repeated that they become ingrained when as adults we don't need them anymore, but yet they keep coming back and basically messing up our lives. We're on autopilot, we don't realize it, and it's causing problems. So that's how this book views it. Did you say something, Dan? Oh, okay. So James Allen is talking about the same idea. Cognitive behavioral therapy, you probably all heard of that. It's a very popular way of dealing with people who are having trouble with their lives. It's based on Pavlov. Do any of you remember Pavlov from your elementary school? He's the guy that trained dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell because they knew when the bell rang, they'd get something to eat. And then he'd stop giving them something to eat and they'd still salivate. So I can make your body do something because of your thought, even though it doesn't make sense because there's no food there. Mindfulness is something more recent that's been emphasized, but it's the same idea. Be aware of your thoughts so then you become able to change them if you wish. The 12-step programs began in 1935 with Alcoholics Anonymous, and based on scripture, but also on the same idea of change your thoughts and you can overcome addictions and the bad habits that we all have. And it doesn't mean it's going to be easy for the rest of your life, but one day at a time, one thought at a time, it can be done what would seem otherwise impossible. It's all based on scripture. And I'm going to read something from James Allen as well. But I'm going to read, I belong to an Al-Anon group for a number of years, which is to help people who are living with someone with alcoholism. And I found a really good one that lines up with what James Allen wrote. Okay, I'm just one pager. It said, at an Al-Anon meeting, we discussed the way our housekeeping habits reflect the effects of alcoholism. One person shared that his life felt completely unmanageable unless his house was perfectly neat. Tidiness gave him an illusion of control. So this is your chronic, gotta keep everything spick and span because I feel better that way. Others, including me, says the writer, spoke of floors strewn with clothes, books, and papers that we could not cross the room without stepping on or tripping over. I had always considered this just a bad habit until I heard someone share that this clutter was her way of keeping people at a distance and isolating herself. Then I remembered that in the house where I grew up, clutter served this function. I was afraid to invite friends over because everything was too messy. I was uncomfortable to realize that I was doing the same thing in adulthood that had kept me isolated as a child. So taking a fresh look at what I thought was just a bad habit, I can free my life from some clutter when I consider the hidden motives for that habit without condemning myself or my family. Clutter doesn't have to be physical. It could also be mental, spiritual, and emotional. And I can heal without making moral judgments about myself or others. Simply by thinking about it in a different way. She had a new way of dealing with a habit that'd been her whole life long. So call out a day of the year, a month and a date, and I will read what James Allen has to say. So you can get a taste of the type of things he says. Anybody?
October 27th.
Is that your birthday?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I kind of thought so. October 27th. All right. October 27th. In the perfect chord of music, the single note, though forgotten, is indispensably contained, and the drop of water becomes of supreme usefulness by losing itself in the ocean. Sink yourself compassionately in the heart of humanity, and you shall reproduce the harmonies of heaven. Lose yourself in unlimited love toward all, and you shall work enduring works and become one with the eternal ocean of bliss. Man evolves outward to the periphery of complexity, and then evolves backward to the central simplicity. When a man discovers that it is mathematically impossible for him to know the universe before knowing himself, he then starts upon the way which leads to original simplicity. He begins to unfold from within, and as he unfolds himself, he enfolds the universe. Cease to speculate about God and find the all-embracing good within you. pretty deep stuff. But this is 1800s. You know, I actually changed some of the words because it's more these and thous and that old-fashioned language. But I find some things I have to put a question mark beside, and some things it's like, that so rings a bell with a Bible verse I know. It's Jesus talking in a sense. Another one? What's your birthday, Matt?
April 8th.
April 8th. Okay. April 8th. When perfect good is realized and known, then calm vision is acquired. The transcendent life is ruled not by passions, but by principles. It is founded not upon fleeting impulses, but upon abiding laws. In its clear atmosphere, the orderly sequence of all things is revealed, so that there is seen to be no more room for sorrow, anxiety, or regret. While men are involved in the passions of self, they load themselves with cares and trouble over many things, and more than all else do they trouble over their own little burdened, pain-stricken personality, being anxious for its fleeting pleasures, for its protection and preservation, and for its eternal safety and continuance. Now, in the life that is wise and good, all this is transcended. Personal interests are replaced by universal purposes, and all cares, troubles, and anxieties concerning the pleasure and fate of the personality are dispelled like the feverish dreams of a night. Universal good is seen. It takes a while to think about some of these, but I find that I can get a lot of good out of this man's writings, but it's like anything. I can't espouse all of them. Yes?
I really appreciate how he keeps returning to the word good. It seems as if he's clearly influenced by Plato, who coined that word. And the way that he's using it is, to me, the way that you should use it. It's not in a sense of a moral term, like that's a good action or that's a bad action, but it's a way of life. The word that came to me was theoria, which Aristotle uses the term. Theoria, he uses it in a very special way. Of course, it can be connected to the word theory, so how he's speaking of principle, but it's really a way of seeing the fullness of life around you. And as he's mentioning, it's a way of becoming that fullness as a way of life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He talks a lot about setting aside our own passions and will for the better of all concerned. Not a lot of specifics. So it's very generals, I find, is his things. That personally, I need more than generals to guide my life, but he's got the right idea, I think.
When you were discussing your the woman who has the clutter issue in the Alcoholics Anonymous,
Mm-hmm.
That really resonates with what you just said about James Allen, he understands, I guess, how, as you mentioned, how ingrained that anxiety or those patterns are in our thinking, and how much we identify with those patterns. But the thing is that that's not something that we need to identify with. Like,
oh, yes, there's a mic there. Sorry, I forgot about
yeah,
that.
I should be doing that.
I don't think it's not on. Okay.
Is that better? Is it not?
He's going to turn it on right now. Try again.
Hello?
It's not on there.
Is it plugged in?
Okay, I think it's good.
There we go.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the comment that I really was reflecting on the way that I think so much that these ingrained reflexes or these ingrained passions, that they have to be a part of my identity, but they don't. They're something that I've learned in the same way as that dog learns the sound of the sound of the bell. That identification is so ingrained, and it's so much ingrained into my identity, but it doesn't need to be. It's not. It's something that, as you mentioned, it's a choice that we have. It's a choice that we have to change that, and I really resonated when you mentioned that.
Yeah. And yet, when it manifests itself in a physical way, it's not going to immediately leave us just because we understand what it is. For example, every once in a while, I have a real problem with my tummy. And the last 2 times it's happened, I realize it's because something's coming up, or I'm afraid something's going to start happening that I'm a little bit afraid of. So I'm becoming aware of that now, but I'm still not feeling good. I didn't have much supper tonight because it happened today. But I'm starting to understand that possibly what is the root of it I had never realized that before. So things like that can happen, and it could be anything: clutter, upset stomach, headaches, all kinds of physical ailments. There's a woman called Louise Hay who wrote a book called You Can Heal Your Life, talking to people about their physical ailments and connecting it with what their thoughts are, which is, it seems a little bizarre sometimes, but I'm sure there's something to it. So. I was going to mention too, there's a number of Bible verses which tell me this is not a new idea. Dan, today you mentioned Psalm 19, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, God. So way back when the Psalms were written, God is concerned with our thoughts, the meditations of my heart. The 10 Commandments, number 10, thou shalt not covet. Nobody can see if you're coveting, but God can. He cares about what we're thinking, because what we think determines how we feel, determines what we do, and only we can change our thoughts. We might not be able to change that first one, but we don't have to stay with it. And that's the point, is we have to have the confidence to say, this is not the way I want to think. And it's going to be a battle. There's a war going on, but it doesn't mean I have to give in. I want to read this one from November 18th, because I thought it was really good about how this one connects really well with the you are not your brain idea. Was it November 18th? It says, there is no more painful bondage than to be at the mercy of one's inclinations. The law is that the heart shall be purified, the mind regenerated, and the whole being brought into subjection to love, until self be dead and love is all in all. For the reign of law is the reign of love, and love waits for all, rejecting none. Love may be claimed and entered into now, for it is the heritage of all. Ah, beautiful truth, to know that now man may accept his divine heritage and enter the kingdom of heaven. Oh, pitiful error, to know that man rejects it because of love of self. Obedience to one's selfish inclinations means the drawing about one's soul clouds of pain and sorrow which darken the light of truth, the shutting out of oneself from all real blessedness. For whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. There is no greater liberty than utmost obedience to the law of being. So in a very flowery, poetic way, he's saying the same things that scripture says. 1 Peter 2 says, beloved, I urge you to abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. Arm yourselves with the mind of Christ. Arming means there's a battle. Titus 2 says, God's grace instructs us to deny ungodliness and worldly desires and live sensibly and godly. So that's really all I have to say, and I thought I'd introduce this guy to you if you didn't hear of him before, and certainly open to discussion. I don't know what my time Is it?
Well, I wasn't keeping track.
Okay, I don't know either. No clock. But there's a lot of good stuff in there for good food for thought, and to know that really James Allen, Norman Vincent Peale, this guy who wrote Jeff Keller, You Can Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. It's all basically confirming what's already in the scriptures if you really look for it. So our thoughts, we have to be more than our thoughts, but our thoughts are the root of all things, and we control where they grow.
And I love the Alcoholics Anonymous motto, one day, is it on?
It doesn't sound like it's on.
Oh,
Sorry, that's me.
Oh,
okay.
Testing, there we go. Yeah, I love the Alcohol Anonymous motto, one day at a time.
mm,
I think that's so powerful because for anyone struggling with addiction, it can be like a dragon to deal with if you think of it on a long-term scale, because an addict is so trapped inside the moment of trying to alleviate some trauma that they're dealing with.
mm,
So by rooting the saving power or the saving grace within that moment, one step at a time, then that
mm,
relieves the burden of I really have to suffer for this long. You know, that's
Yeah.
the kind of the
it's
driving-
too long.
It's,
It's too
yeah,
long. Yeah.
it's like that's kind of what stops somebody from taking steps within the moment itself, because of that dragon of how long it feels that they have to yeah.
To deal with it, yeah.
Yeah.
And I find, I mean, my first husband did drink, but he wasn't, as bad as some, I could say. But the mottos and the instruction in this book, I've continued to use just for daily life, dealing with other people, dealing with myself, being patient with myself, one moment at a time sometimes, about whatever's, worrying you, or it can be used and applied in many different ways. So, absolutely. If we all had to think about the rest of our lives and how we're going to manage it, we just want to hide our head in the sand maybe, or we'd be so happy we wouldn't see the dangers before us and not be careful. No. Okay, any other comments? Nope. Okay, thank you. Mhm.
Maybe I'll go this way instead. Because this won't go all the way. Maybe I'll put it in the middle. It's probably a good idea to do that. I don't think it's on. There we go. Okay. Okay, everyone. Thanks for... I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, so I'm just going to write this word here. I'll try to see so Anna can see too. I'm kind of in the way a little bit, so I'll step back in a moment. I am right-handed. Just enough space. Okay, I wrote a word here. It says philosophia. Philo means love, and then Sophia means wisdom. When I say this word of philosophia, or the love of wisdom, what do we think that wisdom is? What does that word mean to us?
Practical knowledge.
Interesting. So practical knowledge. Practical knowledge, there's a word for that in Greek. The word is phronesis. Phronesis, which is practical wisdom. And when you say practical wisdom, Dave, like where does that wisdom like take place? Like what instances are you speaking of practically?
It covers kind of a wide territory there.
Definitely does. But do you mean actions? Like, do you mean the action that a firefighter makes when he runs into a burning house to save someone who, do you mean that kind of practical, or do you mean more so in the way of getting things done?
Being able to prioritize fast.
Being able to prioritize, what was the last thing you said?
Well, I said fast.
Yeah, being able to think quickly. Interesting. So you think that, so being fast, that's an interesting way to think about it. So being able to prioritize quickly, being able to deliberate and think, maybe that would be something like wisdom. Is there anything else that comes to you?
I think perhaps practical wisdom just generally being able to value things correctly. So, for example, when a guy calls you on the phone telling you how he's a Nigerian prince preparing to give you millions of dollars, practically you can assess that that's probably not true.
So you'd say that's what wisdom is? It's being able to assess whether something is misplaced or not?
Yeah, that's what
And therefore, to make a decision, that requires action or choice, which will have consequence.
Can someone who knows nothing, who wouldn't know in the instance how to deal with the Nigerian prince, could that person still be wise?
Maybe not in that situation.
Right, maybe not in that situation. So you'd say that would be an unwise decision if he was to fall for and get scammed.
Yes.
That would be unwise.
Is it good judgment?
You'd say it would be a bad judgment if he was to get scammed. Yeah. Okay. So what we've come to, we've said what Dave first said, that wisdom is being able to deliberate quickly. Okay, fast. And then Anna is saying that it is being able to make a good judgment. Being able to make good judgment, okay? Okay. Also, Dave said that it's practical as well. It's having to deliberate with decisions and making choices for things that are that we need to deal with. Okay. The reason why I'm asking is because I am interested in philosophy as a way of life. And what I'm hearing is that everyone thinks that wisdom has to do with how we assess situations and how we then make choices and judgments to deal with these situations. But what came to my mind is, as Anna mentioned, right, just because a person doesn't make a wise decision doesn't mean that the person is not wise. So if that's the case, then have we really understood wisdom?
A wise person would learn from their mistakes. They can see exactly. A wise person, okay, I'll wait till. Hello?
Hello? It's on? Okay. A wise person is not necessarily wise in every aspect of life, but a wise person will become wiser in the areas where they're not yet wise enough by learning from mistakes, from judgments that they realize later could have been better.
Okay, so would that be to say that wisdom is understanding how you do not know something rather than knowing something?
I would say that's definitely part of it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to reiterate that. Yeah, wisdom certainly has to encompass making mistakes. That's part of life. That way you can know the wrong way and hope to avoid that in the future. That's part of wisdom, is knowing which way to go. And sometimes the best way for us to know which way not to go is experiencing it. It's not, the experience in and of itself is not enough, because people go through stuff all the time and they don't learn from it.
Mm-hmm.
But it has to be the experience plus, moral knowledge is what I think part of philosophy is the love of wisdom with regard to morality, like how you treat one another and how you get along, that sort of thing.
Thank you for saying that, Dan. That really sediments my view as well. Yeah. Socrates was called the wisest man to ever live, and Socrates said that he's only wise in that he does not really know anything at all. He thinks he knows nothing, and in that sense, he's called the wisest man.
Yeah. The more wise a person is, the more they realize how much they don't know.
Yeah, but I also like what Dave was picking up as well. Dave was picking up on virtue as well. Virtue as acting in right relation. Why I am so interested in the idea of virtue and how it connects to wisdom is, if I could talk about someone who is a Jesus to me, which I'm not sure how to think about this yet, but it is the mythological figure. His name is Odysseus. Odysseus, he's this guy in myth, and I can't articulate the tremendous sway and power that I've read in reading Odysseus. Because to explain a little bit about Odysseus, he's this guy who to explain a little bit, thanks, Dan, I appreciate it.
Get a little bit of feedback because you're technically
Understood.
the speaker, so
Gotcha. That's probably better. That's probably way better. There you go. Yeah, so Odysseus, he's this guy. I'll just explain a little about him. He's a captain of this Greek army that's around in Homer's time, which is about 1600 BC, so very long ago. And he's this adventurer. He goes out and he always knows what to do. He's this super practical guy. He's always on his feet, always quick to think. There's a lot of stories about Odysseus, like how there's a classic myth of how he was on this sea, and you have the sirens who are in Greek mythology, and the sirens are these figures who call out using these beautiful voices, and it drives every man mad, and they jump out of their boats and then they drown because they're so eager to get to the sirens because of what they're hearing. And Odysseus, it relates exactly to what Joanne just said, because Odysseus is on this boat, and the sirens start to call. So he has his crew with him on the boat, and he gives them, and he's so quick to think, he says, I'm going to give everyone beeswax to put into their ears so you don't hear the sirens. But tie me up on this pole with rope, and don't put beeswax in my ears, because I want to be the only man to hear the sirens and not go mad. So the crew ties him up on the pole, and he's up there on the pole, and the sirens start to call. And Odysseus, having complete self-mastery and complete control over himself, hears the call of the sirens, and he's the only one who doesn't go mad, and he survives it. Man, Odysseus is the guy. He's the guy. So,
He's like Jesus.
exactly. He is my Jesus. He is my Jesus. I just want to say, because, I, at work as I'm dealing with stress and as I'm dealing with challenge, I think of Odysseus. I don't ask what would Odysseus do, but I feel as if the myth of Odysseus has really shown me what can I do. How can I take self-control, and how can I get mastery over myself in the same way that Odysseus did? And that's the power of myth. That the myths that we read, they are alive. They are alive. This word, alive, and I'm using it in a very special sense, right? I have the hyphen alive. A means to be offset, and live means to live. The Greeks have a beautiful word for this, zoon. And there's other abbreviations of this to say zontanos means alive. But then zone means living. And Aristotle uses the word when he says humankind is zone logon ekon. Zone logon ekon, which means man is, people will translate it as the rational animal. But really, you can say it means man is the animal endowed with speech, endowed with living speech. And that's another thing that Odysseus embodies. He's this quick speaker. He's able to talk his way out of situations. He has such a command over language that he's able to get out of situations, and he's able to make things conform to what he sets out, what his vision is. Yeah. Why I'm bringing this up is because Aristotle is using that phrase, man is zoon logon ekon, man is endowed with living speech, to mean something so powerful, which is the fact that we have such a power at our disposal, which is in the living speech that we embody and the community that we have. And that has helped me so much, because I've learned how to talk to people differently. I used to, whenever I made a mistake, for example, or whenever someone else made a mistake, I wouldn't be able to talk to them and look them, and actually just speak to them and just say, hey, I don't like that you're doing that, or I don't like how that makes me feel. But I'm using this in a very special sense, that when you tap into what James Allen was speaking about, which is this divine order or this divine principle, then you can speak, you can embody your own speech in such a way where it draws people in to what the Greeks call zoon, what is alive, what is in life.
If I may, it's interesting to think that you can speak truth or honestly about yourself. Oh, yeah.
There you go. Yeah, cool.
I guess I should.
I can speak on this.
You can speak truth or honestly about yourself. Let's say, if you're like learning to confront people in a kind way, not a jerky way, but to say, hey, I don't like what you're doing, and here's how it makes me feel.
Yeah.
That's honesty, that's truth, and that's, I think, more so what you're talking about. But there's also the masks that people put on and the lies that people say about
That
themselves,
is
even
the
about
really
themselves,
strange
with
thing.
whether they are even conscious of it or not, right?
Yeah.
You want to be able to get better at being more truthful and honest.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because if we really evaluate our own lives, we'll find things that we cannot stand in the face of. We find things that we will shirk away from, that we will retract away from or wince away from. And what's fascinating is that what I've learned through Odysseus is that you can look at things, and you don't have to shirk away from them. You don't have to retract from them. You can stare them down and you can face up to them and look at them. That's the thing that I've learned from Odysseus, that he's able to have and this is what James Allen means by the good. And it's fascinating because this is what so there's a word that the Greeks use, theoria, right? Of course, theoria has theo, right? What does theo mean? It means divine, right? If you look at the etymology for theoria, I'll just go to the next page. Theoria. If you look at the etymology, it means to spectate. Or it can mean a spectacle. Aristotle thinks that theoria is a philosophy of life. He thinks it's the highest way to live. And what does that mean? It means to it has to do with vision and it has to do with outlook. And this connects to Plato's idea of the Paideia, or what he means by form. So he calls this the Paideia. This is what an Paideia is to Plato. Basically, it means to find a way of envisioning well, I guess, the good. And as you find a way to envision the good, that means that you can look at things, you can have an outlook on them, and I love what Dan said, because that really just kind of, again, hammered down my views on that to be in virtue means to stand in, to put yourself out in such a way where you do not shirk away from the thing you're putting yourself out to. Yeah.
So are you saying we see good in all things, even if they tend to be scary? Or
Yeah.
stressful? We look for the silver lining and focus on that.
And that is an idea in the Bible. Of course, you have, I'm not sure where the verse is, but of course, I think that's the phrase is that God reigns on both good and evil, or something like that, where God's reign is being put into the realm of evil and being put into the realm of good, that it accompanies both realms. Yes, that I totally agree with that idea, that you're looking at something in a way because it completely relates to your presentation a lot, Joanne, because you're very right to say that that woman at the Alcohol Anonymous meeting, not to throw her or anything,
But basically, you're right to say that she labeled that thing of clutter as a habit that she had, but she didn't give it any more thought. But then as she had this insight about it, then that changed the way that she saw the way that she was living, and that changing the way that you see is what Plato means by the Paideia. We call it an insight. And what do we mean by insight? Well, it means, and look at what all the words I'm using that points to vision. Vision, outlook, insight, spectacle, right? This has to do with a way of seeing. Philosophy as a way of life is also philosophy as a way of envisioning what you want for your life. And to connect it all back, when we think of the word wisdom, Sophia, Aristotle basically connects this theoria. Basically, Aristotle thinks that Sophia, the highest form of Sophia, basically he thinks the highest form of Sophia is theoria. The highest form of wisdom is being able to look at something in a way to not shirk away from it. That's also a virtue. But if we tie back our idea to not knowing something, well, that's an interesting thing to tie back to. How are we meant to think of that? Well, I don't know. That's kind of ironic. And Socrates is a very ironic person. So that's fitting. But maybe I'll say one other thing on, if we're talking about Plato and Aristotle. What Plato thinks of that way of looking at something in a way where you do not shirk away from it. He actually connects the idea of the soul to it. What the Greeks call psyche. And he says something like, the soul is to auto shoto kinon. The soul is self-moving motion. The soul is self-moving. It moves itself. It moves itself. What did we just learn from Joanne's presentation? We just learned that we learned that there is a way where you can be deliberate about your actions in such a way where you actually can have control or self-mastery over the actions that you have. That's what he means by self-moving. Plato is a depth psychologist. He's trying to get into the very deepest part of how you see yourself. And he's trying to show you. How you can change yourself for the better. That's how I read Plato. So what I mean here is when he's saying that the psyche is self-moving motion, that it's able to deliberate on what it thinks about. It's able to deliberate on the choices that it makes, but it's in a special way where it is a way of life. It is a way of envisioning your life. Yeah.
You say then it's the ability to think about how we think.
Yes, it definitely is a metacognition. It's definitely a way to think about how we think. I would agree with that.
Jung or whomever would say the conscious and the unconscious mind.
Isn't it
sort of along those lines, though? you're gonna be driven by your unconscious mind all the time.
Yes.
But you can learn to be more conscious. That's why people practice meditation.
I agree with that, but this. I'm trying to think of a quote from the philosopher Heraclitus, and he says something like, the soul he says something like, no matter how far you go, you cannot travel all the paths of the soul. It's a very cryptic thing that he says. No matter how far you go, you cannot travel all of the paths of the soul. This, when I think of the conscious and the unconscious, Dan, I think of what you'd normally think of the sun, like the thing we can see and things we can't see. But that's not what this is about, though. This more so is about the possibilities that we have. The possibilities, what Aristotle calls dunamis. Yeah, so it's interesting. So you're right, dunamis, you can think of the word dynamic.
If I may, sorry to hijack your talk.
No worries, yeah, please.
If tell me if this is right. I'm just purely going off of knowing that the word dynamics is used in music. It refers to how quiet you get or how loud you get, and possibilities are how quiet you get and how loud you get.
Interesting.
In
Yeah.
life, so.
I like how that you're using the metaphor there of trying to think about something as an amplification of louder and quieter. And you're totally right. It's interesting that you just you're totally right to say that part of us that wants to get self-mastery over herself, the Greeks have a word for that too. It's the daimon. They call it a daimon, which also you can see, it's interesting that if you replace that, it actually looks like the word demon. But the Greeks had a very special way of thinking about the word demon, not as in the Christian sense, but in the sense of the underworld. They thought that there was this river called Lethe, and that when we were to die, we go to drink. We drink from the river of forgetting, and that's when we're put under. But I'm using it. Yes, I'm using it in a very special sense when I say dunamis. It really means possibility, but Aristotle uses it in a very special sense. And this is the word that comes to my mind of how he's describing it. I think of it as the word traverse, to be able to traverse, or to be able to. It's basically being able to. It's a very strange sense of thinking about it. Basically, the Greeks think that the soul is something that is held out before us. It's held out before us in a way where we can move with what is held out before us. And this is how they understand what life is. They think that when that to be alive means to be held out before us and be following the things that are louder, right, rather than the things that are quieter, right? So they would say that the daemon is that. It's being able to get into touch with the things that are louder. In other words, to make it in very simple terms, what we mean by louder here is following of the voice in us that tells us to do something in a way where we feel good about it, where we feel virtuous about it.
Yeah, because I've made the point in sermons before of you can access this part of you and listen to your own voice and follow that louder part of you, so to speak, the part of you that wants to actualize possibilities. But to your point, what you just said is, we want to be able to do that in a way that's virtuous and moral so that we can feel good about what we're doing. But people who are evil can also listen to that voice, that loudness part of themselves, and do evil. So it's still a journey. It's not either or. It's both and. This is super important, but then also learning what morality and what virtue is also important. You have to combine the two. What you're talking about, I think, is the mechanism, how we make choices, how we live our lives.
Yes.
But you still have to learn what virtue is.
That's true. There needs to be principles that.
Yes, that's a great word. Principles that you're living by, like a standard. Otherwise, how can you ever be satisfied with yourself or know that something good is good?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's how I think of philosophy. I think of it as a way of life that can show us choices that we can make. And I found incredible results in thinking of philosophy like that. And if I were to tell you any single point in time, that would make no sense, because this is to be thought. And this is an interesting thing that it opens up a can of worms, but basically that we don't have a good way of thinking about time, as big as that sounds. Because we normally think of the choices that we make in a way of thinking about them as states, like specific states or points in time, or that one domino that finally is the last one to fall kind of thing. But it's interesting because Aristotle tries to get out of that way of thinking about it, and he thinks of it as not a state, but a mode. He didn't say this, but I think he would call it an existential mode. It's a mode, or it's a way of actually living. And I just want to, one last thing before maybe I end my presentation, but basically I want to say one other thing about this word zoon. Zoon means living in the way that the Greeks understand it. Zoon, if you take it at its root, the most root word, zoon comes from za, and za means very, which is why I liked what you just said, Dan, about louder or quieter, because the Greeks have a very special way of thinking about life, and it connects to this word that we use, which is very mysterious, I have to say, but it's very. So, for example, they'll say za menos. Zamenos means very godly. And they'll also say zapuros. Zapuros, which means very fiery. And they're always using this word when there is a divine presence that is before them, such as the Greek gods, like Athena or Zeus. It's really interesting. So basically, they connect this word za to the presence of the divine, the presence of a god. And even that for the Greeks is so interesting when you think about what it meant for a divine thing to be looking at them. They didn't think of it as this passive thing where a god is all the way far up in the clouds simply just staring down at me. But what they thought was, they actually thought of the god's vision as something that illuminated themselves, that actually gave, wow, a god's looking at me, I can act in the best way that I can.
The word channeling rather, applied, like they're channeling the essence of that god
Yeah.
in their action. They're not
Yeah.
looking at that god as some abstract thing. No, it's literally
Exactly. That's a good way to start thinking about the way of life. That is so interesting how the Greeks think of it, that's like to that very degree of living. That's how they're thinking about it, which I find is fascinating. Yeah. So when I say when I think of living, and even living speech, the logos, how I think of that is the way in which we command our language to draw us all into the sphere of life, into the sphere of what is actually happening, into the sphere of what is actually important and what matters. Yeah, so I hope that I was able to embody a chain of thinkers in my talk today, which is all of the ancient Greeks like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and Heraclitus and Parmenides, because I hoped to show that there is well, I guess as an note, that I find that wisdom is something that always makes things more mysterious in such a way where we can say that we don't really know them, but we can say also that we're somehow getting better because of that.
I have some further comments. Do you guys have anything?
Well, I was gonna bring up something that's more particularly Christian.
Yeah, okay, good. That's the point I was going to make here. I think, Mike, you do it. Because everything, let me just say this, everything that you're saying is very religious, if we want to use that term.
Yeah.
And I see, perfect parallels in Christianity.
There is, for sure.
So it's sort of like...
I want to ask, though, how do you find, like, what if... So I find that, I don't know why, but when I read the stories of Jesus, I don't get the same resonance that I do in reading someone like Odysseus. So even though I understand the principles of Christ, Odysseus just does it for me. He just, in every way, I feel like I'm able to live a better life by not just thinking about Odysseus as a person, but trying to embody Odysseus. It's incredible.
There are archetypes that even Jesus is fulfilling, and that same archetype is in Odysseus. But something I was going to say is, you said that you don't get the same sense or feeling or experience when reading Jesus. I would probably think that that's probably just because you and most people, all of us, don't fully know the Jewish context in which he's speaking.
That's true.
And or perhaps not really even getting what he's saying.
Yeah.
Because we're missing the context in which he said it.
I think I agree.
Yeah, so all I mean by that is, like, Greek philosophy is a little more similar to modern sensibilities, whereas Jesus is an ancient Jew talking within that context. So, hey, that's the job of me. One of my jobs is to show you the teachings of Jesus and have it make sense, right? So, hey, that's informing what I might be preaching on next. No, it should be good.
I think what's interesting is
Here, flip it on.
what I think is interesting is how when we discuss theoria, it has you said it has like a divine connotation to it. Right?
That's
So-
how Aristotle used it as well.
Yeah, because I looked up the definition of theoria. It has two, and one of them is seeing. Well, it has more than that, but one of them is seeing. But also another one is more theoria is the process of bringing someone to visit, like the Oracle of Delphi, right? So that has an
the divine
connotation
presence.
to it.
Yeah.
Right? So it is, in a sense, a kind of divine seeing. And it's interesting how theoria, on the one hand, it has an occult implication or a theological implication, but on the other hand, theoria is how we understand modern science. So there seems to be something occult.
You're right.
About the way that we understand, and what I don't mean occult in a New Age sense. I simply mean that there's a divine work at play, even in the act of knowledge. And I'm trying to, because I'm still trying to understand what a Christian conception of revelation is. But my understanding is all truth, okay, that we can wrestle with, that our intellect can contemplate, is an act of revelation. And the means by which God can reveal himself to us could be almost endless. So take, for example, Freud, who says that religion is wish fulfillment. Even if it's true that religion is wish fulfillment could be the very means by which God reveals himself to us, right? And your discussion about how human beings, the soul, the way you articulate the relationship between us and the soul is like the soul is laid out before us, or maybe God is laid out before us, and we're kind of living through the soul or living through God in a particular way. And I think that's what we mean when we say that God is everywhere, or at the end of the day, God is everything.
Yeah.
What else was I going to say to that? Yeah, so we have to, and in classical Christian theology, there is this saying that faith before understanding, right? So you first have to have faith before you can understand. And my understanding of that, so this is like a major claim in Christianity, and my understanding of that is that before we could know anything, we have to be able to trust what's revealed to us.
Yep.
Through the various means by which truth can manifest itself to us, whether it is wish fulfillment, whether it is through the arts, whether it is through the sciences.
That's also an issue, though, and there's an issue with that, because it's an issue when we begin to trust in a way where we make that thing that we're trusting in make that thing that we're trusting in a thing, right? Or something that is. It gets into a whole discussion, but Heidegger calls this ontotheology. So he says that basically, he has a problem with it, because he says that when we make something into a thing, then that takes away the trusting aspect in it, because it's something that we can trust in. And
yeah, I agree with you, and I think that this is Heidegger. Although I disagree with Heidegger, I think his return to Aristotelian way of thinking about the world is generally right. But what he's trying to do is take about the phenomenological insights, but removing the rest of his metaphysics.
Yeah.
Right. What was I going to say? And what Heidegger and these other sort of post-metaphysical philosophers are trying to do, they're trying to challenge like classical foundationalism. And what I mean by that is this idea that we can create an entire system of knowledge based on a fundamental principle that we can understand. So I think, therefore I am is the classic example.
Yeah.
So that's supposed to be the principle. That's the one thing we can't doubt. And on that one thing, we can build all these systems of knowledge.
Yeah.
So Heidegger and all the post-metaphysical philosophers,
Husserl.
they would reject.
Yeah.
They would reject that. But Christians would also reject that. But what's interesting about Christianity would also reject the assumptions of postmodern philosophers, right? So what Christians do, rather than putting kind of the arche or the foundation in their own mind, okay, the foundation is in God or specifically in Christ. So the foundation of all knowledge is not something that we come up with, it's something that's revealed, it's just simply given to us.
Yeah.
Right? So that's how we, as Christians, we can agree with the postmodern philosophers in their critique of modern thoughts, modern science, okay, but we don't have to accept the kind of nihilism that comes with postmodern thought. Anyway.
Understood.
Anybody else?
So perhaps slightly off topic, but something I've been mulling over the last couple days, and maybe you'll have a bit of an answer to this. Do you think that self-mastery requires having a grand vision of life?
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a really good question, right? Like, wow, like seriously. Because that one grand vision, that's the thing that I believe, yes, that is the thing that can create self-mastery in yourself.
Sweet.
Is it because without a grand vision, you're not able to have, to use the biblical metaphor of sin, is missing the mark.
Mhm.
So in other words, you need to have some kind of mark to hit in mastering yourself. You need to know what the target is. And without a grand vision for your life, you can probably come up with some individual goals that you want to work on, but your growth as a person is not going to really progress the way it should without something within to be within.
Yeah. And that's the understanding of the angel in Christianity, right? That the angel is, Roque, a beautiful poetic verse I'll cite.
Spirit.
Sorry?
Spirit.
Well, yes, I could speak about this, but Roque says, fate is like a wonderful wide thread in which every thread is guided by an infinitely tender hand and laid alongside a hundred others, right? So in that sense, that this would be an understanding of the angel in Christianity, that the angel is like a thread that's that guides you, right? And and that guiding kind of vision is that actually was one of the first breakthroughs that I had in philosophy that I could really call a breakthrough when I thought about the angel in Christianity. But of course, the God
must be referencing, church art, like, because that notion of well, I suppose angels lead you into the presence of God in the Bible, but I think it's more so coming from a later church tradition, which is fine. It's just the way that they imagine.
Yeah, but but what really was a breakthrough for me was to stop thinking about angels as a thing, as an entity that I'm just following, right? I actually thought of angels as something like imagine that there's self one and self two. Self two is in the future and self one's in the past, and it's like and the breakthrough for me was that, wait, hold on a minute. The past and the future, in other words, the self that's now and the self that's in the future, that, as mystical as it sounds, those two selves are not different. That there's actually some connecting dots that are, but when you think about that actually, and then you take that into the moment, you take that into local instances, then you can actually say, I can control myself. I can make deliberate decisions in such a way where self one can become self two, right? And then you understand what becoming is, right? And that's right. And that's the understanding of what I think of as an angel. That an angel lets you become. It lets you become the thing that you.
That which connects you to your future self.
Yes, it's the thing that guides you into your future self.
There's a Seinfeld bit where he's like, night guy loves to stay up late and whatever, but morning guy hates night guy.
Yep.
Like it's the idea of that's you. Why would you screw yourself over? Staying up late or whatever. Like there's a disconnect between your future self and your past self.
Right. You're right. And I used to think about that idea, and I used to make jokes with my friend about that the Chris tomorrow will hate the Chris now, or and it is funny to think of it like that. But I'd also like to invite that there's a way in which you can, in the same way that that girl had insight. She had an insight that about the clutter, where she was thinking about It's like, oh, this is just something like a habit that I have, but it's no. There's actually real importance to the decision that I'm making now, so that how it leads, how it's guided into all the decisions that will be available to me in the future. And when you start to think in a grand scale like that, it's like that's powerful, right?
You're inspiring future servants.
All right, that's my presentation. My presentation. If anyone else doesn't have any closing comments or anything.
I just want to mention that you said Odysseus.
Yeah, Odysseus.
Hello? You said Odysseus inspires you more than Jesus.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if it's because I seem to vaguely recall Odysseus from my elementary school year.
Yeah.
I think. But it's like an adventure story.
Yeah.
Okay. Which has specifics. Like he's in this specific situation, this is specifically what he does.
Yep.
Okay. Now we have that in the stories of Jesus as well, but we don't have it to the degree of detail always. Like we don't have his thought process of, okay, the Pharisees are now challenging me on this particular.
That's true. There's a quiet,
So
there's
I'm
mysteriousness.
going to think about, this is how my thought process works. He just comes out with it, and it's like, wow, he's so wise. And he just, basically, he shows them up as not being very smart, and they, of course, think that they're the smartest. Really, his actions are more, he's healing people, which we can't do.
If there's mysteriousness to
There's
it.
things that we can't do, and Odysseus, I don't know, you can get tied to a mast, I can do that, right? He's not realistic even though he's mythical, and Jesus is maybe more mystical even though he's real.
I really appreciate that, because this is the thing that doesn't really resonate. Not really, I don't want to say really, it's just, I want to say that there's some part of Jesus that's so mysterious, and that's so withheld. It's withheld and reserved in a kind of way where it is reserved in a kind of way that is but can simply only be said to be like a son of God, right? It has this incredible aura. He has an aura around him when he walks around, and he heals people through the aura that he has, and right. But what really resonates with me with Odysseus is something that's very opposite, right? Jesus' power withdraws. It withdraws, right? It withdraws into the little words that he says and the simple actions that he does. But Odysseus embodies the epic.
More exciting.
He is. He's more exciting, and he embodies the epic. He embodies the way of life that can stimulate you into a way of life, a Sophia, a wisdom. And that's the thing that really appeals to me about Odysseus, as young as I am.
It could also be that is what draws you. Other people, like, they're more drawn to more the intellectual
Deliberation.
of Jesus. But yet Jesus manifested so many of the Old Testament characters, like Joseph in Egypt, sold by his brothers, and refused Potiphar's wife's seductions, and all these things, and the way he reacted. Like
Mastery.
There's a lot more action there, maybe. I mean, the crucifixion of Jesus was action, but everything that led up to it is more that we don't, like you said, we can't see all the details of how he thought, and
That's true.
what
I think
makes
that's a
him
good
tick,
point.
What makes him tick?
That's a good point. Thank you for.
But there's Joshua. There's all the Old Testament precursors to Jesus who show us the parts of him that are more
Yes.
exciting, maybe?
That's the thing, right? Because it's so important to me. It's how. How do I live, right? And Odysseus provides that to me. I really want to get to you, Matt. I just want to say one thing that I just want to share, like as a kid, I would be playing soccer and I would simply be like, why should I win? Like, what's the point of winning? What's the point? It's just one game. As we were talking about with Dan, it's not just one game. It's not just one game. And the Greeks understood this, right? There's this one quote from this offhand guy. He says, all men are equal. In the same way as we were talking about with God, reigning on good and bad, all men are equal in the eyes of the gods. But then he says, as a side, but I'll be damned if another man bests me. I'll be damned if another man bests me. Yeah. So I understand why you may not like that at first, but he's saying that no one out of any of us is the best, right? But I had this idea as a kid saying, these guys are just born as the best. These guys are just born as the best. They're better than me. Why should I compete against them? Why should I have that competition to win against them? Well, the Greeks had this intense understanding of life in such a way where it's embodied in this quote, despite the swearing, where they're saying, none of us are the best. None of us are the best. And because none of us are the best, because we're all equal, essentially, that means that I can compete against you, and in a way where I can have some chutzpah and say, but I'll be damned if you're better than me. And I like that because it gives you some, because it gives you some oomph. But am I really after oomph? Am I really after intensity? Am I really after I don't think that I'm after I guess that the whole presentation was to say, there's a way to reevaluate your own way of life, and that's kind of what draws me into that. Matt, do you have something to say?
Yeah, no, I think you're right about in a certain sense, I think you're right about this characterization of Jesus as like a passive force throughout history. And Nietzsche and these other philosophers, they like Jesus, but they actually don't see somebody like Jesus as being a real force in history because he's passive, peaceful, unlike somebody like Odysseus, right, who's aggressive and commanding.
He's a tactician. He's the strategist. He's always trying to strategize, and he's trying to incorporate tactics into dealing with things. And it's always in the light of the epic. And the light of the epic is really what I find is something that's so core to my life that because that I haven't really yet understood. But that's something that really just motivates me and gives me passion, and it helps me. It really helps me in like situations where I'm shirking away from. It really does inspire me. Like I could really talk for hours about Odysseus. He's such an amazing person, and yeah. Well, he's not a person because he's a mythological figure, but.
I wonder if the person who invented Odysseus had Jesus in mind.
I'd say that was Homer. Homer invented Odysseus. Or well, he really didn't invent Odysseus, but he was the one who's actually giving me the vision that I have of Odysseus. I'd recommend reading the Iliad. The Iliad is a fantastic book, and of course, the whole premise of the Iliad is in a war, but then after the war, there's another book that Homer writes called the Odyssey, which is about Odysseus, and it's about a voyage returning home. Odysseus is lost at sea, and he has to get back to his son, Telemachus, and his wife Penelope. And oh man, I love talking about this. It's so amazing. Yeah, just really happy to be talking about this.
As a mother of 3 boys, maybe just because you're a guy.
Could be.
And you're more competitive.
Could be.
Most women. Most women are more cooperative. Most guys are more competitive. That's just the way God wires us.
Understood. I think there could be elements that I see in Odysseus that could, as you mentioned, I don't think there has to be a disconnect between one person and the other and having to be a fan of one and not a fan of the other. I think that there certainly is, a way to, like, there's a way in which there's similarities between them. So.
Okay. Something I've enjoyed reading about recently is the Ottomans and the way that they basically the process of becoming a sultan. So, in particular, one figure that I find very interesting is this is the 9th Sultan Selim. So, basically the way that the selection process works is that his father, Bayezid, has a bunch of sons, and then they all have to kill each other to obtain the throne.
Okay.
And so Selim is the 3rd son, and he's sort of put in this very disadvantageous position where his father favors his firstborn, and his entire life is dedicated to becoming this sultan. And so it's a very interesting story about how he basically strategizes, for example, making friends with the enemies of his brother, for example, for use several years later.
That's interesting. This is the thing, right? I think that. So I'll give you an example, and this is not me. But for example, Mike Tyson, he's one of the best boxers in the world. He's one of the best boxers in the world. Well, Mike Tyson, he said that as he was growing up, these great figures were influencing his fighting style, like Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, all these people who were vicious, right? Vicious people. Right, vicious people, and he makes it very clear that he said that, as he was studying them, he would try to understand their mindset. He would try to understand the mindset of them, right, and that would then help him, as Dave mentioned, in his practical wisdom and actually applying the, certain mindset that he seemed to learn from these conquerors to himself. Well, that's not the thing that I'm interested in. I'm not interested in trying to ramp up one's emotions, to be more vicious, and to be. I think that this is the thing with Aristotle that I really love. It's that Aristotle is concerned with wisdom, and he's also and in this wisdom he's also concerned with acting in right relation. And this is the thing that Jesus, I find, is amazing at embodying, which is. Being in right relation with oneself, where the words of his enemies are not sullying his mind, but he has such a pure mind that it's the words that are able to be understood and grasped with, where he doesn't have any issues with them at all because they're of God. So the temperament that Jesus has, I really respect, and I love that. That the dignity, the grace, right, the reservedness, I think that's beautiful, right? But what I miss in Jesus is that counterpart of Odysseus, which is the epic. The epic not as the viciousness of the Romans, right, but the epic as the adventure, right? And as Joan mentions, maybe I'm just not reading the parts of the Bible that actually does happen with Jesus, right? Jesus does go on adventures. He goes into the desert and wanders the desert as he's on the fast, right? He's always walking. He's always traveling. He's never stationary. He's always walking out and meeting new people and healing new people. And there probably is an element that that let's say even if Jesus was real, that you could never actually capture without actually being there and being an apostle and witnessing that.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to say, I think story of Slum in particular actually embodies wisdom much more than it does viciousness. And one of the reasons I would say that is because it's very much believed that he did not enjoy the process of becoming a sultan, in that he only had one son after that. Also, I'm not trying to convince you that real figures are better than stories.
You're right. That was a presentation that I actually wanted to do this night. I wanted to actually do it on a real figure. Is the guy? His name is Werner Herzog. Have you heard of Werner Herzog? He's the only filmmaker who's traveled all the continents in the world, and he has amazing films where he is basically Odysseus on a very small scale, because these again myths live. They're not these things that we like stories. They're actually things that are actually involved with living itself. So Werner Herzog, he's this guy who's really interesting. He made this movie where he went into this part of the Amazon where there was disease and death, but he went into this part of the Amazon, and he wanted to make a movie where these people have to get this boat over this one hill, and he actually made a movie where these people are actually pulling up this boat over this hill, and his whole filmmaking style is trying to find that morsel of the soul that is able to overcome difficulty and challenge and hardship, and that is very inspiring. You're right to say that real stories, you're right, do highlight the myth, but I find myth is more important than real stories, ironically, because when we see it in real life happen, we always think of the other person, and we never think of ourselves. And it's inspiring to see that. But when we see myth, I found that when I thought of Odysseus, I didn't just think of him as another person where it's like, oh, this other person is amazing, I wish to be like him. But rather, I saw parts of myself become illuminated, and that, it's hard to really explain, but yeah.
Yeah, I think I understand. I think a lot of people that